The radio crackled with static, then silence. Major Ken Vargas stared at the tactical display, watching friendly icons blink and fade like dying stars. The valley below was a killing field. Insurgent positions dug so deep into the ridgeline that 3 waves of precision strikes had barely scratched them. His ground element was pinned, bleeding, running low on ammunition. The sun hung low over the Afghan mountains, painting everything in shades of rust and shadow. He'd already called the retreat. Alpha Company would withdraw under cover of smoke, leave their dead for later retrieval, mark this operation as another strategic failure in a war full of them. The decision sat in his throat like broken glass, but command was command. Then the radio sparked to life again. A woman's voice, calm as Sunday morning, cut through the chaos. Saber 1, this is Revenant 3, I'm 5 mics out, full combat load, requesting target brief. Vargas felt his jaw tight. Revenant 3, he knew that call sign. Everyone did. Captain Lydia Cale, the A-10 pilot they'd stuck on close air support duty like she was flying a cargo route. The one with the spotless record who'd never gotten the sexy assignments, never made the highlight reels, never got interviewed for the recruiting videos. The Air Force's quiet professional. The one people forgot about until they needed someone to do the work nobody else wanted. He'd heard stories. She'd logged more combat hours than most fighter jocks saw in their entire careers, flying low and slow over some of the ugliest terrain on Earth. But this wasn't a milk run. This was a meat grinder. The enemy had entrenched themselves in a network of caves and reinforced positions that overlooked the entire valley floor. They had anti-aircraft artillery, shoulder-fired missiles, and the high ground. Sending in an A-10, a slow, lumbering, titanium-wrapped relic from the Cold War, wasn't courage, it was suicide. Revenant 3 negative, Vargas said, forcing authority into his voice. Target environment is too hot, we're pulling back, RTB and await further. Saber 1, with respect, I can see your smoke from here. I can see you're wounded, give me the brief. There was no anger in her tone, no defiance, just the quiet certainty of someone who'd already made her decision. Vargas looked at his tactical officer, Lieutenant Chen, who was already pulling up the targeting data. Chen met his eyes and gave the smallest nod. The major hesitated. If she went in and got shredded, it was on him. The A-10 Warthog didn't roar into battle like the sleek fighters that dominated the promotional footage. It announced itself with a guttural, industrial thunder that rattled teeth and made the ground feel heavier. Revenant 3 came in low, just above the ridgeline, her twin engines trailing faint exhaust against the amber sky. From the ground, she looked almost prehistoric, a metal predator designed for one purpose and refined over decades into brutal efficiency. The nose was blunt, angular, built around the GAU-8 Avenger rotary cannon that made up nearly a third of the aircraft's weight. Her wings were straight, thick, mounted high on the fuselage to protect them from ground fire. Beneath them hung an arsenal, Maverick missiles, rocket pods, Mark 82 bombs, and enough 30mm ammunition to turn hardened targets into scrap. The canopy sat far forward, giving Captain Cale an unobstructed view of the battlefield. She could see everything. The smoke trails rising from Alpha Company's position, the muzzle flashes sparking along the eastern ridge, the dark mouths of caves where the enemy had fortified. Most fighter pilots operated from altitude, watched the war through screens and targeting pods, dropped ordnance from miles away. Lydia Cale flew close enough to see faces. She banked hard left, descending further, and the Warthog responded with the sluggish, deliberate grace of something too tough to care about elegance. Anti-aircraft tracers lanced up from 2 positions simultaneously, bright green lines that stitched the sky around her. She didn't flinch. The A-10 was built to absorb punishment, redundant flight systems, a titanium bathtub around the cockpit, engines separated and shielded so one could fail and she'd still fly home. She'd taken hits before. Holes punched through the wings, hydraulic lines severed, entire sections of tail shot away. The plane always brought her back. Saber 1, Revenant 3. I have eyes on 3 hardened positions, Eastern Ridge, Grid, November Tango 7482. Troops in contact, danger close. Confirm. Vargas's voice came back tight. Confirmed, Revenant. Friendlies are 200 meters west of that position. I say again, 200 meters. This is danger close. Lydia's hand moved across the controls with practiced efficiency, adjusting her angle of attack, lining up the first target. A reinforced bunker cut into the rock face, its firing slit glowing faintly from muzzle flashes. She armed a single Maverick missile, let the seeker lock onto the heat signature. The tone sang clear in her headset. She squeezed the trigger. The missile dropped clean, motor igniting, accelerating downrange in a streaking arc of white smoke. The Maverick struck with surgical precision, punching through 2 feet of stone and detonating inside the bunker. The explosion vented outward through the firing slit in a lance of orange flame, followed by secondary blasts as stored ammunition cooked off. The entire ridgeline shuddered. On the ground, Sergeant First Class Davis pressed himself against the rocky outcrop, feeling the concussion wave roll over his position. Dust and debris rained down, clattering against helmets and equipment. He risked a glance upward and saw the A-10 banking through a storm of anti-aircraft fire, tracers converging on her from multiple positions. The plane seemed to absorb them, trailing thin smoke but holding course. "Who the hell is that?" someone shouted over the squad channel. Davis keyed his radio. "Whoever she is, she just saved our asses. Keep your heads down." Lydia didn't wait to assess battle damage. The moment the Maverick impacted, she was already adjusting, rolling into a new attack vector. Her eyes tracked across the ridgeline, identifying the next threat, a technical truck with a mounted heavy machine gun, dug into a depression 30 meters north of the destroyed bunker. The crew was scrambling, trying to traverse their weapon toward her. She nosed down, lined up the shot. The GAU-8 roared. It wasn't a sound, it was a physical force, a bone-deep vibration that made reality stutter. The cannon fired 65 rounds per second, each 30mm projectile a mix of high explosive and depleted uranium, designed to shred armor and fortified positions. The gun was so powerful it actually slowed the aircraft when it fired, the recoil measurable even against the Warthog's 11-ton mass. The stream of rounds walked across the hillside in eruptions of pulverized stone and metal, bracketing the technical, and then consuming it entirely. The truck disintegrated in a spray of shrapnel and flame, pieces tumbling down the slope. The surviving crew scattered, running for cover that no longer existed. Lydia pulled up hard, the G-forces pressing her into the seat. More tracers followed her climb, this time from a position deeper in the valley, likely a Zu-23 anti-aircraft gun. The rounds passed close enough that she heard them crack past the canopy. She rolled inverted, glanced up through the glass to locate the source. There, muzzle flashes partially concealed by camouflage netting, positioned in a natural choke point that controlled the valley approach. Smart placement, difficult angle. She completed the roll, dove again, this time coming in from the northwest, using the terrain to mask her approach until the last possible moment. The A-10 skimmed over a dry riverbed, wingtips nearly brushing the jagged walls, then popped up directly in line with the gun emplacement. The enemy gunners saw her too late. Lydia toggled to rockets, selected a full pod, and fired. 19 Hydra 70 rockets rippled off the rails in rapid succession, fanning out in a devastating spread. They impacted across a 100-meter radius, turning the gun position into a crater filled with twisted metal and smoking debris. The camouflage netting caught fire, sending up a pillar of black smoke that marked the position for anyone watching. Major Vargas watched the smoke rise and felt something shift in his chest. He'd been wrong about this. Revenant 3, Saber 1. That's 3 confirmed kills. You're clear to egress. We can finish the rest. There was a pause. Then Lydia's voice returned, still calm, still maddeningly composed. Saber 1, I still have ordnance and fuel. I see at least 4 more fighting positions. Request permission to continue the engagement. Vargas looked at Lieutenant Chen again. The younger officer was staring at the tactical display, watching the enemy icons disappear one by one as Revenant 3 dismantled their defensive network with methodical precision. Chen spoke quietly. "Sir, she's winning." The major keyed his radio. Revenant 3 cleared hot. "All targets on the eastern ridge are hostile. Light them up." Lydia didn't reply. She was already lining up the next shot. The A-10 banked hard, exposing its belly to ground fire for a split second before dropping into another attack run. Tracers followed, but they were fewer now, less coordinated. The enemy was breaking. From his position, Sergeant Davis watched the Warthog make pass after pass, each run precise and devastating. She flew like someone who'd done this 1,000 times, who understood the rhythm of close air support the way a surgeon understood anatomy. There was no wasted motion, no hesitation, just overwhelming, relentless violence applied with absolute professionalism. One of his soldiers, a private barely old enough to drink, lowered his rifle and stared. "I've never seen anything like that," Davis grunted. "You're watching a master class, kid. Pay attention." The fourth pass took out a mortar team that had been raining shells on Alpha Company for the last 20 minutes. Lydia spotted their position by the faint smoke trail from their last shot, adjusted her course mid-flight, and put a Mark 82 500-pound bomb directly on top of them. The explosion carved a hole in the mountainside, silencing the mortars permanently. The fifth and sixth passes were cleanup, small arms positions, scattered infantry trying to regroup. She walked the GAU-8 across the ridgeline in controlled bursts, each one lasting only a second or two but chewing through rock and flesh with indifferent efficiency. The sound of the gun echoed through the valley like rolling thunder, a sound that Alpha Company would hear in their sleep for years afterward. By the seventh pass, there was nothing left to shoot at. The eastern ridge was a moonscape of craters, burning debris and silence. Lydia pulled up, climbing away from the valley, and keyed her radio. "Sabre 1, Revenant 3, target area is clear. I count 0 active hostile positions. You're clear to consolidate and evacuate casualties." Vargas stood slowly, his legs stiff from crouching behind cover. Around him, soldiers were emerging from their fighting positions, helmets tilted back, staring at the sky where the A-10 was making a slow, banking turn toward home. The plane was trailing thin smoke from several hits, but it flew steady, engines humming with that distinctive turbofan whine. "Revenant 3, Sabre 1, that was outstanding work. We're going to put you in for a commendation." There was a long pause before Lydia responded. When she did, her voice carried the faintest hint of amusement. "Sabre 1, just doing my job. Glad I could help. Revenant 3 RTB." The radio clicked off. The A-10 dwindled to a speck against the darkening sky, then disappeared entirely, leaving only the echo of its engines and the settling dust. Lieutenant Chen let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. "Who is she?" Vargas didn't answer immediately. He watched the smoke rise from the ridge, watched his soldiers beginning the grim work of casualty collection and consolidation. Finally, he spoke. "I don't know, but I'm going to find out." Back at Bagram Airfield, the sun had fully set by the time Lydia Cale taxied Revenant 3 into the revetment. Ground crews swarmed the aircraft immediately, eyes widening as they cataloged the damage. 7 holes punched through the wings and fuselage, a hydraulic line leaking fluid onto the tarmac, scorch marks across the tail section where a near miss had superheated the metal. The crew chief, Master Sergeant Rodriguez, walked a slow circle around the Warthog, shaking his head. "Ma'am, you've got to stop bringing her back like this." Lydia popped the canopy and climbed down, her flight suit dark with sweat. She looked at the damage with the detached interest of someone inspecting a scraped knee. "She'll fly. She'll fly after we spend 12 hours patching holes," Rodriguez countered, but there was no heat in it. He'd been servicing Revenant 3 for 2 years, and this wasn't the first time Cale had pushed the aircraft to its limits and brought it home. "You hit anything good?" Lydia allowed herself a small smile. "Ask Alpha Company," Rodriguez grunted, already signaling his team to get started on repairs. Lydia walked across the flight line toward the operations building, her boots crunching on gravel. The adrenaline was fading now, replaced by the deep exhaustion that always followed combat sorties. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the aftereffects of sustained high-G maneuvering and the constant micro-adjustments required for precision close air support. She'd been in the cockpit for 3 hours, most of it under fire. Inside the operations center, the night shift barely glanced up as she entered. Lydia logged her flight time, filed her after-action report with clinical precision, targets engaged, ordnance expended, battle damage assessment. She marked the mission as successful and noted 0 friendly casualties in her sector. Before she could finish, Captain Morris intercepted her. He was a fast-mover pilot, F-16s, the kind of officer who wore his aviator sunglasses indoors and made sure everyone knew his call sign. "Heard you got some action today, Revenant." Lydia didn't look up from her paperwork. "Some. Word is you went full cowboy on a hot LZ. Danger close, multiple gun positions, the whole 9 yards." He said it like an accusation. She set down her pen and met his eyes. Morris had never flown close air support, never loitered over a battlefield while people shot at him from 3 directions. He dropped smart bombs from 20,000 feet and called it combat. "I followed proper CAS procedures and engaged targets as directed by the ground commander," she said evenly. "All within doctrine." Morris leaned against the desk, arms crossed. "Sure, but you know what they're saying, right? That you're reckless. That you take unnecessary risks because you've got something to prove." The room had gone quiet. Other pilots were listening now, pretending to review maps and flight plans but clearly tuned into the conversation. Lydia felt the familiar weight of it, the unspoken assumption that she didn't belong, that every success had to be explained away as luck or aggression or compensation. She could have argued, could have pointed out that her mission success rate was higher than anyone else in the squadron, that she'd logged more danger-close sorties than the rest of them combined, that the soldiers on the ground didn't care about her gender or her call sign, only whether she could keep them alive. Instead, she picked up her pen and returned to her paperwork. "I'm sure they're saying lots of things, Captain. I've got a report to file." Morris watched her for a moment, clearly expecting a different reaction. When she didn't give him one, he pushed off the desk and walked away, muttering something under his breath that she didn't bother trying to hear. Lydia finished her report, signed it, and submitted it through the system. Then she walked to her quarters, a small containerized housing unit she shared with another female officer who was currently deployed elsewhere. The space was sparse. A cot, a footlocker, a small desk cluttered with technical manuals and a few personal items. A framed photograph showed a younger Lydia standing next to an older man in an army uniform, both of them squinting into the sun. Her father, Colonel Marcus Cale, retired. He'd flown helicopters in the first Gulf War, earned a Silver Star for extracting a downed pilot under fire. He taught her to fly in a battered Cessna when she was 14, let her take the controls and feel the way an aircraft responded to intention and touch. He'd also told her, on the day she left for the Air Force Academy, that she'd have to be twice as good to be considered half as competent, that every mistake would be magnified, every success diminished, that the uniform wouldn't protect her from people's assumptions. She'd believed him, still did. Lydia set the photograph back on the desk and lay down on the cot without undressing. Her body ached, muscles stiff from hours of tension and repeated G-forces. She closed her eyes and immediately saw the valley again, the tracers, the explosions, the tiny figures of soldiers moving below. She thought about Sergeant Davis and his troops, wondered if they were sleeping now, if they'd made it through casualty evacuation, if anyone had died while she was lining up her shots. The thoughts followed her down into uneasy sleep, the way they always did. Morning came with the sound of jets launching, the high-pitched scream of afterburners that rattled the thin walls of her quarters. Lydia woke, dressed, and walked to the mess hall for coffee and whatever passed for breakfast. The dining facility was crowded, mostly Army personnel with a scattering of Air Force. She filled a tray and found an empty table in the corner. She'd taken 3 bites when Major Vargas appeared beside her. He was out of his tactical gear now, wearing a clean uniform with the subdued combat patch of the 10th Mountain Division on his shoulder. Up close she could see the exhaustion in his face, the lines around his eyes that came from too many firefights and too few hours of sleep. "Captain Cale," she nodded, setting down her fork. "Major," he gestured to the empty seat across from her. "Mind if I join you? It's a free country," she said, then added, "or at least we're trying to make it one." Vargas sat, placed his own coffee on the table. For a moment he just looked at her as if trying to reconcile the woman eating scrambled eggs with the pilot who'd shredded an entire enemy position the day before. "I wanted to thank you personally," he said. "What you did yesterday, you saved lives. My soldiers would be dead or captured if you hadn't pushed through. That's not hyperbole. That's just fact. Lydia nodded slowly. I'm glad I could help. Vargas leaned forward, elbows on the table. I need to ask you something, and I want an honest answer. When I told you to turn back, why didn't you? It wasn't an accusation. He genuinely wanted to know. Lydia considered the question, turning it over in her mind. She could give him the easy answer: duty, training, adherence to the mission. But something about the way he asked, the directness of it, made her tell the truth. Because I've been doing this job for 6 years, she said quietly. I've flown more close air support missions than anyone else in the squadron, maybe anyone currently deployed in theater. I know what the A-10 can do, and I know what I can do. When you described the situation, I knew I could help. Turning back would have meant letting soldiers die because someone decided the risk was too high. She paused, meeting his eyes. I didn't think the risk was too high. Vargas absorbed that, then nodded. You were right. It wasn't. He took a sip of coffee. Do you know what my guys are calling you now? She shook her head. The ghost, because you came out of nowhere, tore through that ridge like it was nothing, and disappeared before anyone could even process what happened. He smiled, a tired but genuine expression. Sergeant Davis wants to put you in for a distinguished flying cross. I told him I'd already started the paperwork. Lydia felt something tighten in her chest. Recognition wasn't why she flew, wasn't why she pushed through the exhaustion and the dismissive comments and the constant low-grade awareness that she was being judged by different standards. But it still meant something, hearing it from someone who'd been there, who'd seen what she could do. Thank you, sir, she said. I appreciate that. Vargas stood, picked up his coffee. No, Captain, thank you. If you're ever in the area and we need air support again, I'm requesting you specifically. He left before she could respond. Lydia sat alone, her breakfast cooling in front of her, and allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. Then she finished eating and went to prepare for the next mission, because there was always a next mission. 3 weeks later, Lydia found herself back in the air over a different valley, supporting a different unit, facing a different but equally determined enemy. The mission brief had been straightforward: provide overwatch for a special forces team conducting a high-value target raid on a compound suspected of housing a Taliban commander. The team would go in fast, grab who they could, destroy any weapons caches, and extract before reinforcements arrived. Lydia's role was to circle overhead and engage any threats that emerged. Simple, except nothing in Afghanistan was ever simple. The raid went sideways within minutes. The Special Forces team, call sign Dagger 6, breached the compound and immediately took fire from multiple buildings. What intelligence had assessed as a single-family dwelling turned out to be a fortified complex with interlocking fields of fire and at least 20 fighters. The team was pinned in the central courtyard, taking casualties. Revenant 3, Dagger 6, we need immediate fire support. How copy? The voice was strained, breathless, punctuated by bursts of automatic weapons fire. Lydia was already banking toward the compound, eyes scanning the ground. She could see the team's IR strobes marking their position, tight cluster of heat signatures huddled behind a low wall. Surrounding them, muzzle flashes sparked from windows, rooftops, doorways. Dagger 6, Revenant 3, I have your position. Marking targets now. How close can I get? Danger close, Revenant. We're combat's ineffective if you don't engage now. Clear to fire. That meant the friendlies were within the standard safety distance for most weapons. It meant if she miscalculated by even a few meters, she'd kill the people she was trying to save. It meant she had no margin for error. Lydia armed a pair of Mavericks, designated 2 buildings on the compound's perimeter that were pouring fire into the courtyard. The missiles dropped clean, streaked downrange. Twin explosions erupted, collapsing both structures in clouds of pulverized mud, brick, and flame. The enemy fire slackened but didn't stop. More fighters were moving into position, trying to flank the team. She nosed down, brought the GAU-8 to bear. Dagger 6, gun run inbound, north side of compound, danger close. The Warthog screamed over the compound at 200 feet and Lydia squeezed the trigger. The GAU-8 tore into the northern wall, shredding it in a line of explosions that walked across the compound's edge. Fighters caught in the open disintegrated. Others dove for cover that wasn't there. She pulled up hard, rolled, came around for another pass. A rocket-propelled grenade lanced up from a rooftop, missing her left wing by meters. She tracked the launch point, adjusted, fired again. The rooftop collapsed under the weight of 30mm rounds, the fighter and his weapon disappearing into rubble. Dagger 6, north side is clear. What else do you need? West wall, multiple shooters in the compound next door. We can't suppress them all. Lydia spotted the position, another building complex, partially obscured by trees with fighters moving between structures. They were using civilians as cover, or what appeared to be civilians. Hard to tell from altitude. She descended lower, risky but necessary to get a clean view. No, those were fighters, all of them armed, moving with tactical coordination. She toggled to rockets, selected a half pod and rippled them across the western building. The rockets impacted in a rolling wave of fire and shrapnel, silencing the guns. The compound fell quiet. Smoke drifted across the courtyard, and Lydia could see the Special Forces team beginning to move, dragging wounded, consolidating their position. They'd captured 2 individuals, likely the high-value target and an associate, and were preparing for extraction. Revenant 3, Dagger 6, that's effective. We're pulling back to primary LZ. Request you stay overhead until the birds arrive. Copy, Dagger 6, I've got you. Lydia orbited the compound in a wide circle, eyes constantly scanning for threats. Twice she spotted vehicles approaching on nearby roads and made low passes to warn them off. The A-10's mere presence was enough. Most insurgents knew better than to engage a warthog unless they had no choice. The extraction helicopters arrived 12 minutes later, a pair of Blackhawks escorted by Apache gunships. They swept in low, kicked up dust storms as they landed, and the Special Forces team loaded quickly. Within 90 seconds they were airborne again, climbing toward safety. Lydia watched them go, then turned for home. Her fuel was running low and the sun was setting, painting the mountains in shades of copper and shadow. She flew in silence, alone with her thoughts and the steady hum of the engines. Back at base, the Special Forces team found her in the operations center. Their team leader, a captain whose name tape read Hollies, walked straight up to her and extended his hand. His uniform was still dusty, streaked with dried blood that wasn't his. "You're Revenant 3, Lydia shook his hand. "That's me. You saved our lives out there. 2 of my guys would be dead if you hadn't put rounds exactly where we needed them." He paused, seeming to search for words. "I've worked with a lot of pilots. You're the best I've seen." Lydia felt heat creep up her neck. "Thank you, Captain. I'm just glad everyone made it out." Holly smiled, a brief flash of expression. "Dagger team doesn't forget its friends. You ever need anything, you call us." He handed her a patched Dagger team's insignia, a knife over crossed rifles. She took it, nodded her thanks, and Holly's left with his team. Lydia stared at the patch for a long moment, then tucked it into her pocket. Later, alone in her quarters, she would add it to the small collection she kept in her footlocker. Tokens from units she'd supported, soldiers she'd covered, missions that had gone right despite all odds. Each one a reminder that the job mattered, that flying low and slow through storms of gunfire wasn't just adrenaline or duty. It was making a difference in the most direct way possible. She sat on her cot and thought about Captain Hollies' words. "You're the best I've seen." It wasn't the first time she'd heard something like that from ground forces. They didn't care about politics or perceptions or the subtle hierarchies of military aviation. They cared about results, and Lydia delivered results. But back in the squadron, in the ready room and the officers' club, the whispers continued. Reckless, aggressive, trying to prove something. The disconnect bothered her more than she wanted to admit. Lydia knew her capabilities, trusted her training, and believed in the mission. But she also understood that perception mattered in the military, that reputations were built not just on performance but on how others interpreted that performance. And for reasons she'd never fully understood, her successes were often viewed through a lens of skepticism that her male counterparts didn't face. She thought about her father again, about the advice he'd given her: be twice as good. She'd spent years trying to do exactly that, racking up flight hours and qualifications, volunteering for the difficult missions, maintaining a spotless safety record. And it still wasn't enough to silence the doubters. Maybe it never would be. The thought was exhausting. Lydia lay back on the cot, stared at the ceiling, and tried to let it go. She couldn't control what people thought. She could only control what she did. And what she did was fly. 2 months into her deployment, Lydia received orders for a mission that made everything else look routine. A Marine infantry company was surrounded in a valley near the Pakistan border, cut off from resupply, and taking sustained fire from entrenched Taliban positions on 3 sides. Multiple air assets had attempted close air support runs, but the enemy had brought in heavy anti-aircraft weapons, including a reported A-10 shoulder-fired missile system. One F-16 had already been driven off by missile lock warnings, and an Apache had taken damage and limped back to base. The Marines were down to less than a day's worth of ammunition and water. Without resupply or effective air support, they'd be overrun by nightfall. The operations officer briefed Lydia with undisguised concern. "Captain, I'm not going to sugarcoat this. The threat environment is extreme. You'll be operating in a narrow valley with limited maneuver room against an enemy that's specifically targeting aircraft. Command is reluctant to risk another asset, but the Marines are requesting A-10 support specifically. They think the Warthog's survivability gives it the best chance." He paused. "You can decline this mission. No one would question that decision." Lydia looked at the map, studied the terrain, calculated angles and approaches. It was bad, worse than bad. But declining meant leaving Marines to die. She met the operations officer's eyes. "I'll go." He nodded slowly as if he'd expected that answer but hoped for a different one. "We're also sending Revenant 4 as your wingman, Captain Torres. He's got almost as much experience as you, and Command wants 2 aircraft for mutual support." Lydia knew Torres. Good pilot, solid instincts, someone she trusted to watch her back. "Copy that. When do we launch?" 30 minutes. The flight to the valley took 40 minutes, and Lydia spent most of it reviewing the target brief and coordinating with Torres over the secure radio. They'd approach from different vectors, forcing the enemy to divide their anti-aircraft fire. Lydia would go in first, suppress the SAM positions if she could locate them. Then Torres would engage the fortified positions harassing the Marines. It was a good plan. Plans rarely survived contact with the enemy. As they approached the valley, Lydia descended through scattered clouds and got her first clear view of the battlefield. The Marines were dug in on a low ridgeline, surrounded by open ground that offered no cover and no concealment. Smoke rose from multiple points along their perimeter, burning vehicles, improvised fortifications, signal fires. The enemy positions were harder to spot, carefully camouflaged among the rocks and sparse vegetation, but she could see the telltale signs: fresh earth from digging, communications antennas, the faint glint of metal where someone hadn't fully concealed a weapon. And somewhere down there, a surface-to-air missile team was waiting. "Revenant 4, Revenant 3, I'm beginning my approach. Stay high and watch for SAM launches." "Copy 3. I've got your back." Lydia pushed forward, dropping to 500 feet above ground level. The valley walls rose on either side, limiting her escape routes. She armed chaff and flare dispensers, ready to deploy countermeasures at the first sign of a missile launch. Her eyes scanned constantly, looking for threats. The Marines' radio net crackled to life. "Revenant 3, this is Paladin 6. Welcome to hell. We've got multiple fighting positions along the northern slope. Coordinates follow." The Marine forward air controller rattled off grid locations, with the calm precision of someone who'd done this too many times. Lydia copied the information, designated targets on her display. "Paladin 6, Revenant 3, I see your positions. Recommend you keep your heads down. This is going to get loud." She rolled into her first attack run, lining up on a fortified machine gun position that had been raking the Marine lines with interlocking fire. The position was partially dug into the hillside, reinforced with sandbags and timber. She nosed down, armed a Maverick. The missile tone locked. She fired. The Maverick struck dead center, the explosion vaporizing the position and sending a shockwave rolling down the slope. Before she could assess damage, her threat warning system screamed. "Missile launch." Lydia reacted on pure instinct, throwing the A-10 into a hard bank while punching out flares. The infrared decoys burst behind her in a cascade of burning magnesium, each one hotter than her engines. The SA-18 missile, tracking heat signatures, lost lock and veered off course, detonating harmlessly 200 meters away. Her heart hammered. That had been close. She leveled out, spotted the launch point, a narrow ravine on the western side of the valley. The SAM team was relocating, trying to get another shot. She marked the position and called it in. Revenant 4, I've got the SAM location, Western Ravine, grid Papa Tango 3265. You're cleared to engage. Copy 3, rolling in. Torres dove from altitude, his screaming down in a near-vertical attack profile. He salvoed rockets into the ravine, blanketing it with high-explosive warheads. Lydia watched the impacts ripple across the terrain, saw secondary explosions as the SAM team's equipment cooked off. Torres pulled up hard, climbing back to safe altitude. Target destroyed. Nice spot, 3. Lydia allowed herself a brief moment of relief. With the SAM threat neutralized, they could operate more freely. She turned her attention back to the enemy positions surrounding the Marines and began systematically dismantling them. Over the next 90 minutes, Revenant 3 and Revenant 4 worked in brutal synchronization. They'd perfected a rhythm, one attacking while the other orbited and watched for threats, then switching roles. Lydia made pass after pass, using every weapon in her arsenal: Mavericks for hardened bunkers, rockets for clusters of infantry, the GAU-8 for anything that moved. Each attack was precise, calibrated to inflict maximum damage on the enemy while keeping the Marines safe. Twice more, her threat warning system alerted to missile launches, this time man-portable systems, smaller and less sophisticated than the SA-18 but still deadly. Each time, she deployed countermeasures and maneuvered clear. The A-10 took hits. She felt them as shudders transmitted through the airframe, heard the dull impacts of rounds striking metal. Her right engine temperature spiked briefly before stabilizing. A hydraulic warning light flickered on, then off. The plane kept flying. By the time the enemy positions were suppressed, the sun was setting. Lydia's fuel was critically low, her ammunition nearly expended. She made one final orbit over the Marine position, saw them already moving to consolidate and prepare for resupply. The Marine forward air controller came on the radio, his voice rough with exhaustion and emotion. Revenant 3, Paladin 6, I don't have words for what you just did. You and your wingman saved over 100 Marines today. Thank you, just thank you. Lydia's throat tightened. She keyed the radio, tried to keep her voice steady. Paladin 6, Revenant 3. Glad we could help. Stay safe down there. You too, Revenant, we owe you one. Lydia climbed away from the valley, joined up with Torres, and they flew back to base in loose formation. Neither spoke much over the radio. There wasn't much to say. What they'd just done spoke for itself. Landing was routine, though ground crews swarmed her aircraft immediately, cataloging damage. Revenant 3 had taken 12 hits, holes in the wings, tail, and fuselage. One round had struck dangerously close to a fuel line. Another had shredded a section of aileron. The crew chief whistled low. "Ma'am, you've got to stop doing this to my airplane." Lydia climbed down, looked at the damage, felt the familiar mix of relief and exhaustion. She held together. Barely. That night, Lydia sat in her quarters and wrote an email to her father. She didn't usually talk about missions, operational security, and a sense that he'd worry. But something about the day's flight felt significant. She described the valley, the Marines, the moment when the missile locked on, and she'd had to trust her training and the aircraft's design to survive. She wrote about Torres and the way they'd worked together, two pilots covering each other through hell. And she admitted in carefully chosen words that it had been frightening. That despite all her experience and confidence, there had been moments when she'd wondered if she'd made a mistake, if this was the mission where her luck ran out. But she'd pushed through, done the job, brought everyone home. Her father's reply came 2 days later. It was brief, the way his messages always were, but every word carried weight. "You did what you were trained to do, and you did it well. That's all anyone can ask. The fear is normal. It keeps you sharp. Don't let anyone tell you that courage means not being afraid. Courage is being afraid and flying anyway. Proud of you. Stay safe, Dad." Lydia read the message 3 times, then closed her laptop and lay back on her cot. The fear is normal. She'd needed to hear that. The weeks that followed blurred together into a constant cycle of missions, maintenance, and brief periods of sleep. Lydia flew nearly every day, supporting operations across the entire theater. Some missions were routine, overhead patrols that saw no action, shows of force that deterred enemy activity just by her presence. Others were desperate scrambles, emergency close air support for units in contact, danger close engagements that required absolute precision. She became known, not just in her squadron but across the entire air wing and among the ground forces. Soldiers and Marines requested her by call sign. Forward air controllers asked if Revenant 3 was available. Other pilots started paying attention, studying her tactics, trying to understand what made her so effective. The answer wasn't complicated. Lydia flew with absolute commitment. She studied the enemy's tactics obsessively, learned how they positioned defenses, how they maneuvered under fire. She memorized terrain features across the entire area of operations, could navigate valleys and ridgelines from memory. And she trusted her aircraft completely, understood the A-10's capabilities and limitations better than anyone else in the squadron. The Warthog wasn't fast or stealthy, couldn't carry the payload of a bomber or the precision munitions of a fighter. But it was tough, could absorb punishment that would down any other aircraft, and its gun was the most devastating close air support weapon ever created. Lydia had built her entire approach around those strengths. Fly low, get close, hit hard, survive. It worked. 6 months into her deployment, the squadron commander, Lieutenant Colonel Brennan, called her into his office. He was a career officer, A-10 pilot himself, with 2 previous combat tours and a reputation for quiet competence. He gestured to a chair across from his desk. "Sit, Captain." Lydia sat back straight, hands folded in her lap. She'd been in his office before for routine matters, but something about his expression suggested this wasn't routine. Brennan studied her for a moment, then spoke. "You've logged more combat hours than anyone else in this squadron. More danger-close engagements, more enemy positions destroyed, more troops saved. Your mission success rate is perfect. Not a single blue-on-blue incident, not a single friendly casualty attributed to your fires." He paused. "You're also the most requested pilot by ground forces. I've got commanders from 3 different divisions asking for you by name." Lydia nodded slowly, unsure where this was going. "Thank you, sir. I'm putting you in for a Silver Star," Brennan said bluntly, "for your actions supporting Paladin Company. The Marines commander is writing a personal recommendation and I've reviewed the footage. What you did that day was extraordinary. A Silver Star, the 3rd highest military decoration for valor." Lydia felt the weight of it, the implications. "Sir, I was just doing my job." "We're all just doing our jobs, Captain. Some of us do it better than others. You deserve the recognition." He leaned back in his chair. "But I need to ask you something. How are you holding up?" The question caught her off guard. "Sir, you've been pushing hard, flying constantly, volunteering for every difficult mission. I respect the dedication, but I also need to make sure you're not burning out. Combat stress is real and it affects everyone eventually." Lydia considered her answer carefully. She was tired, yes. The constant adrenaline, the broken sleep, the cumulative weight of flying through gunfire and watching explosions, and knowing that mistakes meant people died, it took a toll. But she wasn't broken, wasn't struggling. If anything, she felt more capable now than when she'd arrived. "I'm holding up fine, sir," she said. "I'll let you know if that changes." Brennan studied her, then nodded. "Fair enough, but I'm ordering you to take 3 days off. No flying, no mission planning. Get some rest, decompress. That's not a request." Lydia wanted to argue but knew better. "Yes, sir." She spent the 3 days reading, sleeping, and running laps around the airfield perimeter. The enforced rest felt strange at first, like she was missing something important, but gradually the tension eased from her shoulders and the exhaustion receded. On the 2nd day, she received word that Sergeant Davis and his squad were rotating back through Bagram for resupply. She found them in the transient barracks, a group of sunburned, dust-covered soldiers checking weapons and equipment. Davis recognized her immediately and stood, extending a hand. "Captain Kale, didn't expect to see you here." She shook his hand. "Heard you were passing through, wanted to say hello." Davis grinned, a genuine expression that creased his weathered face. "Boys, this is Revenant 3, the pilot who saved our asses in that valley." The The soldiers gathered around, and Lydia found herself surrounded by men who wanted to shake her hand, tell her their own stories of watching her fly, express gratitude in the rough, sincere way that soldiers did. It was overwhelming and humbling at the same time. One of the younger soldiers, the private who'd watched her fly that first day, spoke up. "Ma'am, can I ask you something?" Lydia nodded. "Sure." "How do you do it? Fly through all that fire and just keep going?" She thought about the question, about the fear and the training and the moments when everything narrowed down to pure focus. "I concentrate on the mission," she said finally. "I don't think about the fire or the danger. I think about the target, the troops I'm supporting, what needs to happen for them to survive. Everything else is just noise." The private nodded, absorbing that. Davis clapped him on the shoulder. "That's the difference between a professional and everyone else, kid. Focus." They talked for another hour, trading stories and jokes, and Lydia felt something loosen in her chest. This was why she flew. Not for medals or recognition, not to prove anything to doubters or critics. She flew for these men, for the people on the ground who depended on her to show up when things got bad and stay until the job was done. When she finally left the barracks and walked back across the base, the sun was setting again, and the sky was painted in shades of orange and purple. Lydia stopped, looked up, and felt the familiar pull. The sky was her element, the place where she made sense. Tomorrow she'd be back in the cockpit, back in the fight. And she couldn't wait. The Silver Star ceremony happened 6 weeks later in a small gathering at Bagram. Lieutenant Colonel Brennan read the citation, detailing her actions supporting Paladin Company, the missile threats she'd navigated, the precision strikes that had saved over 100 Marines. The award was pinned to her uniform by a visiting general, a man whose name she immediately forgot because she was too focused on keeping her composure. Afterward, there were handshakes and photographs, the required formalities. Captain Torres pulled her aside, grinning. "About time they recognized what you do," Lydia smiled. "Couldn't have done it without you covering my back that day." "We make a good team," Torres agreed. "Anytime you need a wingman, I'm your guy." Later, alone in her quarters, Lydia took off the dress uniform and carefully placed the Silver Star in her footlocker with the other mementos. It was a piece of metal and ribbon, significant only because of what it represented. A mission flown well, soldiers saved, a job done right. She'd keep it, but it wouldn't define her. The deployment continued. 8 months, then 9, then 10. Lydia flew through the changing seasons, the brutal summer heat that made the A-10's cockpit feel like an oven, the sudden storms that turned valleys into mud-choked rivers, the crisp cold of high-altitude autumn. Each phase brought different challenges, different missions, different enemies, but the fundamentals never changed. She flew low, got close, hit hard, survived. In her 11th month, Lydia received orders for a mission that would become the defining moment of her career. A joint special forces and CIA operation was targeting a high-value terrorist commander, a man responsible for coordinating attacks across 3 provinces and linked to the deaths of dozens of American and coalition troops. Intelligence had located him in a remote compound in the mountains, accessible only by narrow mountain roads that could be easily defended. The operation plan was complex: simultaneous assault from 3 directions, coordinated helicopter insertion, precision strikes to cut off escape routes. Lydia would provide close air support during the assault phase and be on call for immediate response if the situation deteriorated. The briefing lasted 3 hours, covering contingencies and backup plans and rules of engagement. By the end, Lydia had a clear picture of what needed to happen. She'd be flying alone this time. No wingman because the terrain didn't allow for multiple aircraft in the target area simultaneously. It would be her, the Special Forces team, and whatever resistance they encountered. The mission launched at midnight. Lydia took off into darkness, climbing through scattered clouds toward the mountains. The cockpit was a cocoon of red-lit instruments and the steady hum of engines. She flew on night vision, the world rendered in shades of green, terrain features visible but distorted. Navigation was tricky. The mountains created GPS shadows, and she had to rely on terrain following radar and her own sense of space. The target compound sat on a plateau surrounded by steep slopes, with a single approach road and sheer cliffs on three sides. It was a fortress. The Special Forces team, call sign Tomahawk, inserted via helicopter 3 kilometers away and began their movement on foot. Lydia orbited overhead, watching through her targeting pod as tiny heat signatures moved through the darkness. They were ghosts, shadows, barely visible even with thermal imaging. The assault began at 200 hours. Tomahawk breached the compound's outer wall with explosives, poured through the gap. Immediate gunfire erupted, muzzle flashes bright through the infrared. The team took cover, returned fire, pushed forward. Then everything went wrong. Additional enemy fighters emerged from hidden positions, not just Taliban but experienced foreign fighters with professional training. They'd been waiting. The entire compound was a trap, and Tomahawk was caught in a crossfire from multiple directions. Revenant 3, Tomahawk 6, we are heavily engaged, taking casualties, requesting immediate fire support on coordinates to follow. The team leader's voice was tight, controlled despite the chaos. Lydia was already descending, dropping through the darkness toward the compound. She couldn't use her normal tactics. The friendlies were inside the compound, intermixed with the enemy. Precision wasn't enough. She needed perfect accuracy. Tomahawk 6, Revenant 3, I need target designation. I can't see friendlies from hostiles in this mess. Stand by marking now. Lydia watched her display as infrared strobes lit up at 3 points inside the compound, the Special Forces team's positions. Everything else was hostile. She designated targets, started with the outer positions where enemy fighters were massing for a counterattack. She armed rockets, selected a tight spread, and fired. The rockets impacted in a string of explosions along the compound's eastern wall, silencing the machine guns positioned there. But more fighters were emerging from buildings, some carrying rocket-propelled grenades. One of them fired at the Special Forces team, the warhead streaking across the courtyard and detonating against a wall. Lydia heard screaming over the radio. Revenant 3, Tomahawk 6, we've got 2 urgent casualties. Need immediate CASEVAC, but we can't move until you suppress that western building. The western building. She could see it on her display, a 2-story structure with fighters on the roof and in the windows. The Special Forces team was pinned 20 meters away. Normal ordnance would be too close. The blast radius would hit the friendlies. She needed the gun. Lydia rolled inverted, dove at a steep angle that put her nose directly on target. Altitude unwound rapidly, 2,000 feet, 1,500, 1,000. She could see tracers arcing up toward her, bright green lines that passed uncomfortably close. At 500 feet, she rolled upright, lined up the shot. The western building filled her gun sight. She fired a 1-second burst. The GAU-8's rounds walked across the building's facade with surgical precision, punching through walls and roof. The structure collapsed inward, floors pancaking, dust and debris erupting outward. Lydia pulled up hard, felt the G-forces compress her into the seat, darkness encroaching at the edges of her vision. She leveled out at 3,000 feet, breathing hard. Tomahawk 6 western building is neutralized. What's your status? We're moving, Revenant. 2 wounded, 1 critical. We've got the HVT, but enemy reinforcements are approaching from the access road. Need you to cut them off. Lydia spotted the vehicles on her thermal display, 3 technical trucks with mounted weapons, racing up the mountain road toward the compound. She banked hard, came around to intercept. The road was narrow, carved into the mountainside with a sheer drop on one side. She armed her remaining Mavericks, locked onto the lead vehicle, fired both missiles in rapid succession. The first struck the lead truck, the explosion flipping it over the cliff. The second hit the middle vehicle, blocking the road. The third truck skidded to a halt, unable to advance or retreat. Lydia made a gun run, strafed the trapped vehicle until it was burning wreckage. The road was sealed. Tomahawk 6, reinforcements are neutralized. You're clear to extract. Copy, Revenant. CASEVAC birds are inbound. Thanks for the cover. Lydia orbited while the evacuation unfolded, helicopters sweeping in, the Special Forces team loading wounded and prisoners, the aircraft lifting off and disappearing into the night. The compound burned below, flames casting long shadows across the plateau. She stayed until the last helicopter cleared the area, then turned for home. The flight back was quiet, peaceful almost, the adrenaline slowly fading. Lydia flew through the darkness, watching the sun begin to lighten the eastern sky, painting the mountains in shades of gold. She thought about the mission, the split-second decisions, the calculations of risk and necessity. She thought about the wounded and hoped they'd survive. When she landed, dawn was breaking. Ground crew met her aircraft, and she saw their expressions change as they cataloged the damage. Revenant 3 had taken more hits, 16 this time, including one that had punched through the canopy frame inches from her head. The crew chief, Rodriguez, didn't joke this time. He just looked at her and shook his head. "You've got a guardian angel, ma'am." Lydia touched the hole in the canopy frame, felt the jagged metal. Maybe, or maybe just a good airplane. The mission report came back 48 hours later. The high-value target had been captured alive, along with 2 associates and a cache of intelligence materials. The 2 wounded Special Forces operators would recover. The operation was classified as a complete success. Lydia received a handwritten note from the Special Forces commander, thanking her for her actions, and nodding that without her support, the mission would have failed and casualties would have been significantly higher. She added the note to her collection. The deployment ended 3 weeks later. 12 months in Afghanistan, over 800 combat hours, countless missions. Lydia packed her gear, said goodbye to the crew chiefs and the other pilots, and boarded a transport aircraft for the flight home. She watched the country recede below, the mountains and valleys where she'd spent a year of her life, the bases and outposts she'd flown over, the roads and villages and endless brown landscape. It felt strange to leave, like closing a book before the story was finished. But her part was done. At least for now. The flight home took 20 hours with stops in Qatar and Germany. Lydia slept fitfully, woke disoriented, slept again. When the plane finally touched down at Dover Air Force Base, she walked off into cool American air and felt the disconnect. She'd been at war this morning, and now she was home, and nothing had changed except her. Her father met her at the airport. He looked older than she remembered, more gray in his hair, but his eyes were sharp and warm. He hugged her tightly, didn't ask about the deployment. He'd know she couldn't talk about most of it anyway. They drove to his house in silence, comfortable and understanding. Over dinner, he finally spoke. "You did good over there. I heard things through the network. People talk about you." Lydia smiled faintly. "Good things, I hope. The best things. They say you're the finest close air support pilot in the Air Force, maybe the finest they've ever seen." She didn't know what to say to that. Her father continued. "I'm proud of you, not because of the medals or the recognition, because you did what needed to be done and you did it with honor. That's all that matters." Lydia felt tears prick her eyes, unexpected and unwelcome. She blinked them away. "Thanks, Dad." They finished dinner, talked about small things, his work, the house, neighbors. Eventually, exhaustion caught up with Lydia and she excused herself to sleep in her old room. It looked exactly as she'd left it, posters on the walls, books on the shelves, a different life preserved in amber. She lay in the familiar bed and stared at the ceiling, listening to the silence. No jets, no explosions, no radio chatter, just quiet. It should have been comforting. Instead, it felt wrong. She closed her eyes and eventually sleep came, restless and full of dreams she wouldn't remember in the morning. Reintegration was harder than she'd expected. The Air Force gave her 2 weeks of leave, and Lydia spent the time trying to reconnect with civilian life. She went grocery shopping and felt overwhelmed by the choices. She went to a movie and left halfway through because the crowd made her anxious. She tried to explain the deployment to old friends and realized they couldn't understand, not really, so she stopped trying. Her father noticed but didn't push. He'd been through it himself, knew that coming home was its own kind of war. Instead, he took her flying. They drove to a small regional airport, rented a Cessna 172, and spent an afternoon doing lazy circles over the Virginia countryside. Up there, Lydia felt something settle. The controls were familiar, the sky infinite. Her father let her fly, sat in the right seat, and watched with quiet satisfaction. When they landed, he spoke. "You belong up there, always have." Lydia nodded. "I know. You'll go back. Maybe not to Afghanistan, maybe not in an A-10, but you'll go back. It's who you are." He was right, she would. When her leave ended, Lydia reported to her new assignment, instructor pilot at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base, teaching the next generation of A-10 pilots. It was a prestigious position, recognition of her expertise and experience. She threw herself into the work with the same intensity she'd brought to combat. Her students were young, eager, full of confidence that hadn't been tested yet. Lydia taught them tactics and procedures, but she also taught them humility. She showed them gun camera footage from her deployments, walked them through the decision points and the consequences. She made them understand that close air support wasn't about glory, it was about responsibility. Lives depended on getting it right. Some students struggled with her standards. She was demanding, uncompromising, refused to sign off on qualifications unless she was certain they were ready. A few complained that she was too hard, too rigid. Lydia didn't care. If her students went to war unprepared, they'd die or get someone else killed. She wouldn't allow that. Other students thrived under her instruction. They absorbed everything she taught, pushed themselves to meet her standards, emerged as skilled and capable pilots. Those were the ones Lydia remembered, the ones who made the job worthwhile. A year into her instructor assignment, one of her former students sent her a message from Afghanistan. He'd been flying close air support, supporting a convoy that hit an IED and came under fire. He'd used the tactics Lydia had taught him, put rounds exactly where they were needed, saved lives. His message was brief. "Thank you for preparing me. You were right about everything." Lydia read the message 3 times, then saved it. That was why she taught. Not for gratitude, but to know that when her students faced the chaos and violence of combat, they'd have the skills to survive and succeed. The years passed. Lydia, promoted to major, continued instructing, occasionally flew operational missions when units needed experienced pilots for specific tasks. She maintained her edge, stayed current on tactics and technology, never let herself become complacent. Other pilots came and went, some washing out, others moving to different airframes or leaving the service entirely. Lydia stayed. The A-10 was her aircraft, close air support her calling. Nothing else held the same appeal. She watched the Air Force debate the Warthog's future. Budget analysts argued it was outdated, that modern fighters with precision weapons could do the same job. Lydia knew they were wrong. The A-10 wasn't about technology. It was about presence, about putting a pilot low and slow over the battlefield where they could see and react and adapt. It was about the psychological impact of the GAU-8, the reassurance that ground troops felt when they heard that distinctive sound. It was about survivability, about bringing pilots home even when they'd been shot to pieces. But institutional momentum was hard to fight. The A-10 fleet shrank. Some aircraft were retired, others sent to the boneyard at Davis-Monthan, parked in neat rows under the desert sun. Lydia watched them go and felt a quiet anger. They were throwing away capability that couldn't be replaced. Then came the crisis that changed everything. A regional conflict in Eastern Europe, a peer adversary with modern air defenses and mechanized forces. American ground troops found themselves facing an enemy more sophisticated than anything they'd encountered in the Middle East. The sleek fighters and advanced drones struggled against layered air defense systems. Casualties mounted. Someone remembered the A-10. The aircraft that everyone had wanted to retire suddenly became essential again. Units were reactivated, pilots recalled from other assignments, and Lydia, now a lieutenant colonel with more combat experience than almost anyone in the Air Force, received orders to deploy. She'd command a squadron, 18 aircraft, 50 pilots and crew, supporting operations across the theater. It was the assignment she'd never dared to hope for. Lydia said goodbye to her students, packed her gear, and prepared for war. Again. The new theater was different from Afghanistan in every way that mattered. The enemy had sophisticated radar systems, mobile surface-to-air missiles, electronic warfare capabilities. They had trained pilots and modern aircraft, not just insurgents with rifles and RPGs. The air war was contested, dangerous in ways that required entirely new tactics. Lydia adapted. She studied the enemy's doctrine, learned their patterns, developed new approaches that leveraged the A-10's unique capabilities. She taught her pilots to fly low, use terrain masking, coordinate with electronic warfare assets to suppress air defenses long enough to make their attacks. She emphasized survival, come home, every mission, no heroics. But she also emphasized commitment. When ground troops called for help, her squadron would answer. Always. The first major engagement came 3 weeks into the deployment. A mechanized enemy column was advancing on a key logistics hub, threatening to cut off an entire division. Air assets had been attempting to slow the advance, but the enemy's mobile air defenses were taking a toll. 2 attack helicopters had been shot down. An F-16 had been damaged and barely made it back to base. Command was reluctant to commit more aircraft. Then Lydia got the call. Revenant 6, this is Sabre Actual. We need your squadron to hit that column. It's the only way we stop them. Lydia looked at the tactical display, calculated odds and angles. It would be costly, but necessary. Sabre Actual Revenant 6 understood, we're launching now. She assembled her pilots, briefed the mission with brutal honesty. This is going to be the hardest thing we've done. The threat environment is extreme and not all of us may come back. But if we don't stop that column, thousands of soldiers will be cut off and destroyed. We're going. Questions? No one questioned. They knew the stakes. 18 A-10s took off in coordinated waves, each flight of 4 aircraft with specific targets and routes. Lydia led the first wave, Tors flying as her wingman like old times. They approached the enemy column at low level, hugging terrain features to avoid radar detection. Electronic warfare aircraft preceded them, jamming enemy systems and creating brief windows of opportunity. When they popped up for their attack runs, all hell broke loose. Surface-to-air missiles launched from multiple positions, tracking systems locking onto the warthogs. The sky filled with tracers and explosions. Lydia saw one of her pilots take a hit, his aircraft trailing smoke but staying airborne. She forced herself to focus on the mission. The enemy column was spread across several kilometers. Tanks, armored personnel carriers, mobile air defense systems, support vehicles. High-value targets everywhere. She armed her entire loadout, began systematically destroying vehicles. Mavericks for the tanks, rockets for the personnel carriers, the gun for everything else. Each pass brought her through concentrated fire. Each pull-up was a gamble that the missile tracking her would miss. Behind her, the rest of the squadron pressed their attacks. 18 A-10s unleashed overwhelming firepower, and the enemy column disintegrated under the assault. Vehicles burned, ammunition exploded, survivors scattered. It was devastation on a scale that redefined what close air support could achieve. But the cost was high. 3 aircraft took major damage. 1 pilot was forced to eject, picked up later by rescue forces. Another limped back to base with half her wing shot away, landed on foam and walked away from the wreckage shaking but alive. When Lydia landed and climbed out of her aircraft, she found Rodriguez waiting, his expression grim. "Ma'am, we've got a lot of work to do tonight." Lydia looked at the battered aircraft, at the pilots gathering in small groups, still processing what they'd just survived. "I know, but we stopped them." She gathered her squadron for a debrief, went through every engagement methodically. What worked, what didn't, what they'd do differently next time, because there would be a next time. There always was. Over the following months, Revenant Squadron became legendary. They flew missions that other units couldn't or wouldn't attempt, pushed into contested airspace, provided support where it was needed most. Lydia's reputation grew beyond the Air Force, into the broader military community. Ground commanders requested her squadron specifically, knowing that when Revenant answered a call, the job would get done. Her pilots looked up to her with something approaching reverence. She was demanding but fair, pushed them hard but never asked them to do anything she wouldn't do herself. She flew the most dangerous missions, led from the front and brought them home. They called her the Colonel with respect that went beyond rank. But Lydia noticed changes in herself. The constant stress, the accumulated weight of losses and near misses, the responsibility of command, it wore on her in ways she couldn't fully articulate. She slept less, smiled rarely, found herself withdrawing even from the people she trusted. Tors noticed. He pulled her aside after one mission, spoke quietly. "You're running on empty, Colonel. When's the last time you took a day off?" Lydia shrugged. We're in a war, days off are a luxury. You're no good to us if you burn out, Torres pressed. Take care of yourself. That's an order from your friend even if it's not from your subordinate. She wanted to dismiss it, but something in his expression stopped her. Torres had been flying with her for years, had seen her at her best and her worst. If he was worried, there was probably reason. I'll think about it, she said finally. Torres nodded, let it drop. The war continued. Months blurred together. Missions, maintenance, brief periods of rest that never felt adequate. Lydia's squadron rotated through different bases, supported different operations, adapted to changing tactical situations. The A-10 proved its worth again and again, delivering capabilities that no other aircraft could match in the close air support role. But the Air Force was still debating its future. Even as the Warthog saved lives daily, bureaucrats and analysts argued about cost-effectiveness and modernization. Lydia found herself called to testify before congressional committees, explaining why the A-10 mattered, why it needed to be preserved. She spoke plainly, without political polish, and described what she'd seen and done. The impact the aircraft had on soldiers' morale and survivability. The missions that couldn't have been accomplished with any other platform. The lives saved because the A-10 existed. Some committee members listened. Others had already made up their minds. It was frustrating, watching people who'd never been in combat make decisions about combat capabilities. But Lydia did what she could, then returned to the war and focused on what she could control. A year into the deployment, intelligence identified a critical target, an enemy command center coordinating operations across the entire region. The facility was heavily fortified, protected by multiple layers of air defenses, located in terrain that limited approach options. Previous strikes had failed. Command wanted to try again, this time with unconventional tactics. They asked Lydia to plan the mission. She spent 3 days studying satellite imagery, signals intelligence, terrain maps. She built a plan that was audacious and risky but feasible. It would require perfect coordination between multiple aircraft types, precise timing, and pilots willing to operate at the edge of their capabilities. When she briefed it, the operations officer looked skeptical. "Colonel, this is ambitious. The risk level is extreme." "Yes," Lydia agreed, "but it will work. And taking out that command center could shorten this war by months. How many lives is that worth?" The officer didn't have an answer. Command approved the mission. 0 hour was set for 3 days later. Lydia assembled a strike package, 6 A-10s from her squadron, electronic warfare support, fighter escort to suppress enemy aircraft, and a psychological operations element to create diversionary activity. She briefed every pilot personally, walked them through every phase. Then she gathered her squadron and spoke from the heart. "This is the biggest mission we've been asked to do. It's dangerous, and I won't lie about that, but it's also important. If we pull this off, we change the trajectory of this entire war. I trust every one of you to do your part. Fly smart, watch each other's backs, and come home. That's all I ask." They launched at dawn. The strike package assembled over friendly territory, then turned toward enemy airspace. Lydia flew lead, Torres and 4 others in formation behind her. The tension was palpable, every pilot hyper-aware that they were about to enter the most heavily defended airspace in the theater. Electronic warfare aircraft went in first, jamming enemy radar and communications. Fighter escort engaged enemy aircraft that rose to intercept, turning them away from the strike package. Psychological operations broadcast fake radio traffic, suggesting attacks in entirely different areas. Under that cover, Lydia led her A-10s toward the target. They flew at 200 feet above ground level, fast as the Warthog could go, using every terrain feature for concealment. The target appeared on her display, a hardened facility built into a hillside, with multiple buildings and extensive defensive positions. Air defense radars were already tracking them despite the jamming. Missile warnings screamed. Lydia ignored them, focused on the attack. Revenant 6 all flights engage targets as briefed. Make every shot count. She armed her full loadout, designated the primary building, and fired every Maverick she carried. The missiles streaked downrange, impacted simultaneously, punching through reinforced concrete and detonating inside. The building collapsed inward, smoke and debris erupting skyward. Behind her, the other A-10s pressed their attacks, systematically destroying defensive positions, communications antennas, secondary buildings. The facility disintegrated under the assault, years of construction and hardening rendered meaningless by concentrated firepower. But the enemy wasn't passive. Surface-to-air missiles launched from concealed positions, and this time the tracking systems weren't jammed. Lydia saw the contrails, felt her threat warning system go critical. She deployed countermeasures, broke hard left, felt G-forces crush her into the seat. The missile adjusted, tracking through her evasive maneuvers. It was going to hit. Lydia reacted on pure instinct, rolling inverted and diving toward the ground. The missile followed, but at the last possible second she pulled up hard and the missile continued down, impacting the hillside in a massive explosion. She leveled out at 50 feet, heart hammering, hands locked on the controls. Too close. Way too close. Revenant 6, you okay? Tor's voice tight with concern. I'm good. Continue the attack. They finished the mission in under 5 minutes, then egressed at maximum speed, dodging missiles and gunfire until they cleared the defensive envelope. When they finally reached friendly airspace, Lydia allowed herself to breathe. Revenant 6, all flights, status check. One by one, her pilots reported in. All aircraft accounted for, all airborne, several damaged but flying. They'd done it. The mission was complete, the target destroyed. Post-strike reconnaissance confirmed the command center was obliterated. Enemy coordination across the region collapsed within days, creating opportunities that ground forces exploited ruthlessly. The war didn't end, but the momentum shifted decisively. Lydia received the Air Force Cross, the second highest military decoration, for her leadership and actions during the strike. The ceremony was formal, attended by senior officers and dignitaries. The citation detailed her planning and execution, called her an exemplar of courage and tactical brilliance. She accepted the medal with the same composed professionalism she brought to everything else. But afterward, alone in her quarters, she looked at the medal and felt empty. Not because it didn't mean anything, it did. But because she'd traded pieces of herself for it, spent reserves of courage and endurance that might never fully replenish. She was tired in a way that sleep couldn't fix. Tired of the weight of command, of making decisions that could get people killed, of living in a constant state of controlled crisis. Tors found her sitting on the edge of her cot, staring at the medal. He didn't say anything, just sat beside her. After a long silence, Lydia spoke. I'm not sure how much longer I can do this. Tors nodded slowly. You've been at war for most of your career. You've given more than anyone should have to. If you need to step back, no one would blame you. I would, Lydia said quietly. There are people who depend on me, pilots I'm responsible for, soldiers on the ground who need us. And you've served them well, Tors said. Better than anyone, but you're allowed to be human, Colonel. You're allowed to reach your limit. Lydia didn't respond. She sat in silence, feeling the weight of everything. The missions, the losses, the constant pressure, the slow erosion of the person she'd been before the war. Maybe Tors was right. Maybe she'd given enough. The deployment ended 4 months later. 18 months of combat, countless missions, more than 1,000 combat hours. Revenant Squadron returned home to a hero's welcome, ceremonies, media attention, recognition from the highest levels of military and civilian leadership. Lydia participated in the events because it was expected, but her heart wasn't in it. She smiled for photographs, gave interviews, accepted congratulations. Inside, she felt detached, like she was watching someone else go through the motions. When the celebrations finally ended, she took leave and drove to her father's house. He was waiting on the porch, older now, moving with the careful precision of someone whose body wasn't quite keeping up with their will. They embraced, and Lydia felt something crack inside her. Her father guided her inside, sat her down, and didn't ask questions. He just made coffee and waited. Eventually, Lydia started talking. She told him about the missions, the close calls, the pilots who'd been hurt or killed. She told him about the weight of command, the impossible decisions, the way combat changed you in ways you couldn't articulate. She told him about the emptiness she felt now, the sense that she'd given everything and didn't know how to find her way back. Her father listened without interrupting. When she finally finished, exhausted and hollow, he spoke. "You did what you had to do. You served with honor and courage, saved countless lives, inspired the people around you. That matters, but war takes pieces of everyone who fights it. The pieces don't always grow back." He paused. "You need to decide what comes next. You can keep fighting, keep pushing until there's nothing left. Or you can step back, find a different way to serve, give yourself time to heal." Lydia looked at him. "What did you do?" "I stepped back," he said simply. "Took a desk job, focused on training and policy instead of operations. It felt like retreat at first, like I was abandoning something important. But it let me find balance again, remember who I was outside of combat. Eventually, I retired and never regretted it." "You think I should quit?" Her father shook his head. "I think you should rest. Really rest, not just a few days of leave. Figure out what you want, not what you think you should want. The Air Force will survive without you for a while." It took 3 weeks before Lydia made her decision. She requested reassignment to a non-operational role, staff position at Air Combat Command, working on doctrine and tactics development. It would use her experience without putting her back in the cockpit, give her time to recover while still serving. The request was approved immediately. Her reputation and experience made her valuable wherever she went. Lydia said goodbye to Revenant Squadron at a small ceremony, spoke briefly about their accomplishments and her pride in serving with them. Several pilots had tears in their eyes. Torres shook her hand, pulled her into a brief embrace. "Take care of yourself, Colonel, and thank you for everything." Lydia nodded, not trusting her voice. Then she walked away from the flight line, from the A-10s, from the life she'd built for 20 years. The staff position was exactly what she needed. Intellectually engaging but not emotionally draining, important work that didn't require her to put herself in harm's way. She wrote doctrine publications, consulted on training programs, advised senior leaders on close air support tactics. The work felt meaningful, even if it wasn't the same as flying. Gradually, the exhaustion receded. Lydia started sleeping through the night again, stopped flinching at sudden noises, rediscovered interests that had been buried under the weight of combat. She read books, took long runs, spent time with her father. She began to remember who she'd been before the war consumed everything. A year passed, then another. Lydia promoted to full colonel, continued her staff work, and found satisfaction in shaping the next generation of doctrine and training. She stayed connected to the A-10 community, mentored young pilots, occasionally flew sorties to maintain her proficiency. But she didn't return to combat operations. That chapter was closed. Her legacy, however, was just beginning. The tactics she developed became standard doctrine throughout the Air Force. The pilots she'd trained went on to leadership positions themselves, carrying forward her emphasis on precision and professionalism. Her missions were studied in military schools, analyzed for lessons and best practices, and the A-10 survived. The fleet was modernized rather than retired, upgraded with new systems while retaining the fundamental design that made it irreplaceable. Lydia had testified before Congress 3 more times, each appearance reinforcing the aircraft's value. Gradually, institutional opinion shifted. The Warthog wasn't just a Cold War relic, it was a specialized tool that did things no other aircraft could do. Lydia watched these developments with quiet satisfaction. She'd fought for the A-10, proved its worth through action rather than rhetoric. The aircraft would continue flying, continue saving lives, long after she was gone. 5 years after leaving operational flying, Lydia attended an airshow at Davis-Monthan. The base was hosting a demonstration, and one of her former students was flying. She stood in the crowd, anonymous in civilian clothes, and watched the A-10 perform. The aircraft looked exactly as she remembered, ugly, ungainly, beautiful in its brutal functionality. The pilot executed a perfect demonstration: low passes, steep climbs, simulated gun runs. The crowd cheered at the sound of the GAU-8 firing practice rounds, felt the visceral power that made the Warthog legendary. Lydia felt tears on her face and didn't bother wiping them away. After the show, she walked to the flight line where the A-10 was parked. The pilot was doing interviews, surrounded by admirers. Lydia hung back, content to observe. Then the pilot spotted her. His eyes widened and he excused himself immediately, walked straight to her. "Colonel Cale," Lydia smiled. "I'm retired now, just Lydia." He shook his head. "You'll always be the colonel to us, ma'am. I can't believe you're here. That demonstration, I flew it using the tactics you taught me. Everything I know about the A-10 I learned from you or from someone you trained." Other pilots were gathering now, recognizing her. Young faces, eager and respectful, the next generation. One of them, a female captain, spoke up. "Ma'am, you're the reason I joined the Air Force. I read about your missions and I wanted to do that. I wanted to fly like you." Lydia felt emotion tighten her throat. "Then fly well, serve the troops on the ground. That's all that matters." They talked for an hour, these young pilots and the legend they'd heard about but never met. Lydia answered questions, shared stories, offered advice. She saw herself in them, the passion, the commitment, the desire to make a difference. When she finally left the flight line, the sun was setting. Lydia walked to a quiet spot at the edge of the base, looked up at the sky. Somewhere out there, A-10s were flying, supporting troops, conducting missions, doing the work that needed to be done. The work she'd done for 20 years. Her time in the cockpit was over, but her legacy lived on in every pilot who flew close air support with precision and courage, in every tactic and technique that bore her influence, in every life saved because she'd shown what was possible. Colonel Lydia Cale, Revenant 3, had been a warrior. Now she was something more, a teacher, a mentor, a symbol of what dedication and competence could achieve, and that, she realized, was enough. Years later, long after Lydia had fully retired and moved to a quiet house near the mountains, she received a package. No return address, just her name and location. Inside was a worn squadron patch, Revenant Squadron, the unit she'd commanded. Attached was a note. "Colonel, we're still flying, still using your tactics, still bringing everyone home. You taught us well, thank you, always." Revenant Squadron 2035. Lydia held the patch, felt the worn fabric, and smiled. She walked outside to her porch, sat in the fading light and looked at the sky. A single contrail marked an aircraft's passage, too high to identify but moving with purpose. She watched until it disappeared, then went inside. The sky would always call to her, but she'd answered that call, given everything she had, and left something lasting behind. For a warrior, there was no better ending. In the Air Force archives, deep in climate-controlled storage, a gun camera recording sat among thousands of others. The label read simply, "Capt. L. Cale, CAS Mission Danger Close 2024. The footage showed a valley, smoke and chaos, and making pass after pass through concentrated fire, precisely destroying enemy positions while friendly forces huddled meters away. It showed what close air support looked like when done perfectly, with absolute skill and unwavering courage. The recording was required viewing at every Air Force pilot training school, studied by generations of aviators learning their craft. Each time it played, instructors would pause at key moments and explain the decisions, the techniques, the principles that made the mission successful. And they would tell the students about the pilot who flew it, a woman who'd been underestimated and dismissed, who'd responded not with anger but with excellence, who'd proven herself again and again until respect was the only possible response. They would tell them about Revenant 3, the Ghost, the finest close air support pilot of her generation. They would tell them that when soldiers on the ground needed help, when the situation was desperate and the risks extreme, there was one call sign everyone wanted to hear: Revenant 3, inbound. And then every single time that pilot came through, the students would watch the footage in silence, absorbing the lesson. Skill could be learned, tactics could be taught, but the commitment to excellence, the refusal to accept anything less than perfect execution, the willingness to put yourself in harm's way for people you'd never meet, that came from somewhere deeper. That came from character. That came from being the kind of person who, when faced with impossible odds and overwhelming danger, simply said, "I can help," and then did. Years after Lydia's passing, decades into a future she'd helped shape, a new pilot sat in the cockpit of an updated A-10, preparing for her first combat mission. The aircraft had been modernized, systems upgraded, but the fundamental design remained unchanged. The titanium bathtub, the straight wings, the massive gun. She was nervous, adrenaline making her hands tremble slightly. She ran through her pre-flight checklist mechanically, trying to focus. Her instructor, an older pilot with graying hair, noticed. "You thinking about Revenant 3?" The young pilot nodded. "How do I live up to that?" The instructor smiled. "You don't. You just fly your mission, do your job, bring your troops home safe." That's what she did every single time. No magic, no tricks, just professionalism and courage. The young pilot absorbed that, felt something settle in her chest. She could do that, would do that. She finished her checklist, received clearance, and taxied toward the runway. The A-10 rumbled forward, engine spooling up, and she felt the familiar anticipation. At the threshold, she paused, keyed her radio. "Tower, Revenant 37, ready for takeoff." There was a brief pause. Then the tower controller responded, and his voice carried unmistakable respect. "Revenant 37, you're cleared for takeoff. Fly safe, make her proud." The young pilot released the brakes, felt the Warthog surge forward, and lifted into the sky. Below, the base fell away. Ahead, the mission waited. And somewhere in the gathering dusk, in the eternal space between Earth and stars, the legend of Revenant 3 flew on. Because some legacies don't fade. They endure. They inspire. They become the standard against which all others are measured. Colonel Lydia Cale had been more than a pilot. She'd been proof that excellence transcends all barriers, that skill and courage speak louder than any prejudice, that when you dedicate yourself completely to a mission and the people depending on you, you become immortal. Not in body, but in the impact you leave behind. The sky remembers. The troops remember. The Air Force remembers. And every time an A-10 takes off to protect soldiers on the ground, every time a pilot pushes through fear and exhaustion to deliver perfect fire support, every time someone proves that the most important thing isn't what others think, it's what you do. In those moments, Revenant 3 flies again, and always will.